pay attention to what you eat and remove those foods that you know make you smell poorly. When I eat predominantly meat, and especially when I eat only meat, I do not smell. And bacteria is incredibly important for your immune system, for overall health. And you're like, but I need it. If I don't use deodorant, if I don't reapply it several times, I smell really badly. And I'm like, well, let's do the following. I'm going to engage in an experiment with you. Well, actually, my wife did, and he and I, we said, we all stop using deodorant, as of today, and we see how we smell over the next couple of days. What you eat is the most likely factor that contributes to bad body odor. And
you're listening to the Primal Shift podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kummer, and my goal is to help you achieve optimal health by bridging the gap between ancestral living and the demands of modern society. Get ready to unlock the transformative power of nature as the ultimate biohack, revolutionizing your health and reconnecting you with your primal self.
This episode of the Primal Shift podcast is sponsored by WaveBlock, a company that has helped me and my family reduce our exposure to harmful electromagnetic fields or EMFs from iPhones, iPads, AirPods, and MacBooks since 2021. WaveBlock doesn't block EMFs, it disperses them, significantly reducing their intensity. Think of it like stepping into the gentle surf instead of being hit by a powerful wave. With third-party lab tests confirming up to 80% reduction in exposure, WaveBlock helps protect our family without compromising our device's functionality. If you own an Apple or Samsung Galaxy device and want to keep using it with peace of mind, choose WaveBlock for smarter, safer EMF protection. Use code Kummer15 to get 15% off your EMF mitigation sticker on waveblock.com. That's WAVEBLOCK.com. And now back to the episode. A lot of people suffer from bad body odor. And so in this episode, we're going to talk about the biological mechanisms behind body odor, including the role of the sweat glands, the bacteria on the skin, and how they interact to produce odor. We're going to talk about the top reasons that influence, or the top factors that influence body odor. And hint, it's not your personal hygiene. We're going to talk about how to stop smelling without the use of toxic personal care products. And I'm going to share with you my favorite deodorant that I barely use. So let's jump right in and let's talk about the production of sweat. So there are two main types of sweat glands on the human body. The eccrine glands that are found all over the body, and they produce a fairly watery, odorless sweat that helps regulate body temperature. So when you work out and you sweat a lot, the eccrine cells are responsible for producing that sweat. The second type are called apocrine glands, and they're concentrated around your armpits, around your nipples, and your groin. And they secrete a thicker milky fluid in response to emotional stress and sexual excitement. And the fluid itself is initially odorless, but it's very rich in proteins and lipids that bacteria interact with to produce odor. So it's very much the interaction between the bacteria on your skin, and it's, obviously we all have a microbiome on our skin, much like we have a microbiome in our gut, consisting of bacteria and other microorganisms that work together to maintain proper skin barrier and skin health at the end of the day, that influence the immune system and many other things. So it's perfectly normal to have all of the bacteria, but there are a certain composition of that bacteria that can influence then how those bacteria break down and metabolize those lipids and those proteins in your sweat and produce odor. And in particular, the proteins and the lipids from the apocrine sweat are metabolized by that skin bacteria, broken down into smaller compounds, and like fatty acids and ammonia, and that's what smells. So let's talk about now the chemical compounds responsible for odor. I mean, there are many of them, but there are, I guess, three main types that are most likely to produce the smell that you're experiencing. And number one is androstenone. It's a steroid that is converted from testosterone in the apocrine glands, and that can produce a strong musky odor. So I guess that's the manly odor that you might be familiar with. And, a lot of people like that. Some people don't. But I would argue that's probably a perfectly natural type of smell that you might experience. The second compound is called isovaleric acid, and that's produced by bacteria from the breakdown of the amino acid leucine. And that has more like a pungent cheese-like smell, which might be more offending. And number 3 is a compound called 3-methyl-2-hexanoic acid, and it is also a breakdown product of bacterial metabolism and has a distinct sweaty odor, which is more or less offending, but I would argue it's probably more on the less offending side. Now, so let's talk about what components or what factors influence that bacterial activity. And there are several again. Hormonal changes, if you go through puberty or menopause, those changes in your hormones can influence bacterial activity and how they contribute to body odor. Genetics, obviously, everyone is a little bit different, but the number one factor I would argue is diet. The foods you eat influence the bacterial activity, not only the bacterial composition in your gut as well as in your skin and in your mouth, everywhere where there is a microbiome, but it also influences the bacterial activity and how much of that leads to potentially poor or offending body odor. For example, most people know that if you consume a lot of garlic or onions, that can add sulfur compounds to sweat. And when the bacteria metabolizes those compounds, it leads to a pretty pungent smell, right? Some also argue that meat can produce offending odors. We'll talk about that separately. But the bottom line really is what you eat is the most likely factor that contributes to bad body odor. And I'm going to give you one example from a couple of years ago when my brother-in-law came over. He wanted to, I guess, go through the Kummer bootcamp, assume our dietary habits, work out with us, do CrossFit, cold plunge, sauna bathe, do all of the things that we do on a regular basis to kind of, help him reset, get in a better shape and get rid of some of the issues like his acne and, his bad body odor. And when he arrived, he came with his, I guess, drugstore type, deodorant. And I'm like, dude, this is chemical crap. You don't want to use this. It has endocrine disrupting chemicals that can negatively influence your endocrine system, meaning your hormones, especially, your testosterone. You definitely don't want that. So throw it in the trash. And he's like, but I need it. If I don't use deodorant, if I don't reapply it several times, I smell really badly. And I'm like, well, let's do the following. Like, I'm gonna engage in an experiment with you. Well, actually, my wife did, and he and I, we all stopped using deodorant, as of today, and we see how we smell over the next couple of days. And so we did this, and then in a couple of days later, I asked him, so, how do you smell? And he's like, I haven't really noticed. And he did like, this classic, smelling your own armpit kind of test, and like, I don't smell anymore. And I'm like, well, what do you think has changed? And he's like, well, I guess the diet. We're eating predominantly meat, very few vegetables, no junk food, obviously, no processed foods, nothing that, is not part of our regular diet. I mean, we follow an animal-based diet, so it's very heavy in meat and select non-toxic or the least toxic plants. And he stopped smelling. And for the rest of his trip, he stayed with us for a couple of weeks. None of us used the deodorant. We worked out almost every day, doing CrossFit. We were out working in the backyard, in the garden. We sweated a lot and nobody smelled. And that was an eye-opener for him. I already knew, what would happen, but that was an eye-opener for him, recognizing that the food we eat directly impacts how we smell. And if we have a very poor or offending body odor, it's usually the reason for that is usually twofold. One is the food we eat, obviously, if we eat certain, and especially in the plant world, I've yet to meet anyone who eats predominantly meat or is a carnivore with bad body odor. Myself included. If I only eat meat, I do not smell. Yes, maybe my dog can smell me because his nose works 1,000 times better than, a human nose. But there is nothing offending about how I smell when I eat only meat, when I cut out everything else, in particular plants, but also dairy, I would say, probably leads, in my case, to a more musky kind of odor when I consume raw milk. But definitely, if I'm going into starches, into grains and stuff, I smell, and I can tell. And number two is the bacterial composition of your skin, obviously. It's the same as when you fart and you smell like something died inside of you. That's typically a sign of the poor food choices and the poor bacterial composition inside of your gut. And the same applies to the skin. If your skin is made up of too many of the wrong type of bacteria, you're more likely to smell, because that bacteria then produce certain odors. They metabolize certain components from the food you eat, and you smell. And if that's offending, then you got to change something about that. And the easiest way to change the composition of the bacteria, both in your gut as well as in your skin, is with diet. Because if you remove those foods that the bacteria thrive on, they die off naturally, or at least the amount of that bacteria significantly shrinks, and some of the better bacteria move in, take their place, that, don't produce those offending odors. And so that's one thing. And one would argue as well, if I read a while ago an article about body odor, and the number one recommendation was to, wash yourself more often, especially with antibacterial soap, to kill off that bacteria that produces the odor. And that's akin to, regularly consuming antibiotics to kill the bad bacteria in your gut. No, you don't want to do this, because that not only wipes out the bad bacteria, but also the good bacteria. And bacteria is incredibly important for your immune system, for overall health on the skin, for your skin barrier function. You don't want to wipe off all the bacteria. And using antibacterial soap does exactly that. It negatively impacts your skin's microbiome, which is why I don't use soap on my entire body every single day. I don't want to kill all of that good bacteria with soap. Obviously, I don't use antibacterial soap, but just regular soap as well. You want to use that sparingly. Obviously, I use it to wash my hands, if I'm out with the animals or whatever, but, you want to be careful with that. Wiping everything off and sterilizing it is not the best way. It's a terrible way of trying to fix, your skin's bacterial composition. So you don't want to do this. And generally speaking, hygiene, even if you eat well, if the bacterial composition on your skin is where it should be, even if you don't shower in a day or in 2 days or in 3 days, you should not be smelling poorly. I know when I'm out camping or whatever, or out somewhere, hunting, whatever the case might be, and I don't shower, I don't smell, if I eat well, that is. Now let's talk about meat for a moment, because very often, especially if you Google, okay, what causes bad body odor, eating meat is a very popular reason that you might find. And the reason, or the reasoning behind that, is that meat, and especially organs and the liver in particular, contain certain micronutrients that can potentially cause body odor. One of them is choline. It's a water-soluble nutrient that's abundantly found in meat and the liver and other organs in particular. And it's incredibly important, to have enough choline. But when digested, choline can be converted into what's called TMA, or trimethylamine, and by the bacteria in your gut, right? So trimethylamine is then oxidized in the liver to form trimethylamine N oxide, or TMAO. But this process is fairly inefficient, and so when TMA accumulates, it can be excreted through sweat, urine, and the breath, and that produces a somewhat fishy smell. Carnitine is another great example of the same phenomenon. It's also similar to choline. The gut bacteria metabolize it to TMA, and that can then accumulate and lead to a fishy odor when excreted through your sweat, for example. There are also other fatty acids, for example, in meat that can lead, as part of the metabolism, to volatile compounds that can then, once metabolized and excreted through sweat glands, become food for the bacteria, and that again can lead to body odor. There are also certain amino acids. We mentioned leucine already, but also methionine has sulfur in it. So when that gets metabolized, that sulfur-like smell, can be noticeable. Now, here's the thing. All of that, I'm sure, is theoretically correct, but as I've mentioned before, I have yet to meet a strict carnivore within, the human population, that has poor body odor, or that smells, that I've noticed. when I eat predominantly meat, and especially when I eat only meat, I do not smell, Same goes for my wife. Everyone within the family, we've all noticed that by eating only a predominantly meat, we don't smell. As soon as we start including, in particular, plant-based product, but also certain dairy products, we are more likely to smell and have a noticeable body odor, and then maybe need, to use deodorant. But with meat only, I think that if you smell poorly after consuming meat, especially only meat, then I would argue that's an indication of a less than ideal composition of your skin's microbiome. I don't have any other explanation for that because, as I said, I've stood very closely to a Sean Baker, for example. I've never noticed them smell, and that's one of the reasons, because we consume an animal-based diet and we eat a lot of meat and predominantly meat, that we barely use deodorant. I barely use it. I have one stick, and that lasts me for probably half a year to a year because I use it so infrequently. And that's because I usually don't smell unless I eat certain foods. And then, I have to use deodorant. That leads us to what's my favorite deodorant brand, and there are multiple out there, but the one that I like best is from a brand called Nose to Tail. Brian Sanders, one of my friends, it's his brand, and he makes personal care products made based on beef tallow. And the deodorant stick is also made with beef tallow and I think baking soda to change the pH a little bit. And I've been using that, again, infrequently, but nonetheless, whenever I, go to a conference, for example, and I know that I might be exposed to foods, maybe because of a social gathering that I don't have full control over, food that, I know might cause me to produce body odor. So I bring that with me and I use it, and it's very effective. It doesn't stain clothing, because some of the non-toxic deodorants that I've used in the past, they lead to yellow stains in my clothing. And then, I had to throw away, the shirt after a couple of uses, and that's obviously not sustainable. With the beef tallow one and the baking soda from Nose to Tail, I have not noticed those issues. I have a discount code for you. I'm going to link it down below in the show notes. Code MK for $20 off for your first order over $75, including a link. But it's Nose to Tail, Brian Sanders, great product. They have other stuff as well that I use, like a face lotion and stuff. So all good stuff, high quality, non-toxic. I would highly recommend, if you suffer from bad body odor, that you stop using drugstore type deodorants, and even worse, antirespirants, because there is only one way to stop you from sweating in the first place, and those are toxins, endocrine disrupting, toxic, neurotoxic chemicals like aluminum that you definitely don't want. But even most of the regular deodorants that don't stop you from or prevent you from sweating, that just mask or kill the smell, those are all endocrine disrupting. Most of them are. So use products wisely, but better yet, I think the more sustainable approach is the cheaper approach for sure, and the more convenient one is to simply pay attention to what you eat and remove those foods that make you smell poorly. And that's in particular, obviously, anything that's processed, junk food, I shouldn't even have to mention, those should not be part of any diet anyway. But also many plant foods that you might be okay with otherwise can cause you to smell. Dairy, pay attention to that. Maybe dairy is causing you to smell, and just try to stick to meat for a couple of days. You don't have to do it, become a carnivore, but just try eating only meat for a couple of days and see how you smell or how you don't smell. And maybe that's a good cue for you to kind of, shape your diet, in particular when you maybe have to go on business meetings where it's, maybe inconvenient to reapply deodorant every so often. That's a sure way to not smell. With that, we're going to wrap it up. I hope you liked this episode. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Always happy to answer, and I'll see and hear you in the next episode.